I watched in horror as the pristine white golf cart rolled straight through the center of our family garden. Decades of carefully tended heirloom tomatoes, rows of peppers that had grown from seeds my grandmother brought from Italy, herb plants that carried 3 generations of family recipes. All of it crushed under the wheels of our HOA president's golf cart in less than 30 seconds. My grandfather stood frozen beside me. This 80-year-old Vietnam veteran who had built this garden with his bare hands over the course of 40 years. His weathered face showed no emotion, but I could see his hands trembling, not from age, from controlled rage. Richard Blackwell climbed out of his golf cart with a smug smile. He brushed dirt off his expensive polo shirt and looked directly at my grandfather. "Maybe now you will understand the importance of compliance," he said. That was his biggest mistake, because my grandfather was not the kind of man who forgot, and he definitely was not the kind of man who forgave. Let me take you back to where this all started. Our family home sits on a beautiful corner lot in Sunset Ridge, one of those planned communities that developers love to build in suburban America. When my grandparents bought this property 30 years ago, it was just an empty field with potential. But my grandfather Joe saw something special in that patch of earth. Grandpa Joe was not a man of many words. He was a retired landscaper who had spent most of his adult life making other people's properties look beautiful. After serving 2 tours in Vietnam, he came home and found peace in the soil. He met my grandmother Maria at a church social in 1975, and she brought with her a small collection of seeds from her family's garden in Italy. Those seeds became the foundation of something magical. Over the next 4 decades, Grandpa Joe transformed our corner lot into a living work of art. He built raised beds from reclaimed wood. He installed a drip irrigation system that he designed himself. He composted kitchen scraps and fallen leaves to create the richest, darkest soil you have ever seen. The garden became our family's gathering place. Every summer morning, Grandpa Joe would walk the rows with his coffee, checking on his plants like they were old friends. He grew heirloom tomatoes that weighed 3 pounds each. His pepper plants produced enough harvest to supply half the neighborhood with fresh salsa ingredients. The herb section smelled like heaven, with basil and oregano that made our Sunday dinners legendary. But this garden was more than just vegetables. It was our family's legacy. Those tomato seeds had been passed down through 3 generations. The grapevines came from cuttings that my great-grandfather smuggled from Sicily in 1952. Every plant told a story. Every harvest connected us to our roots. When Sunset Ridge incorporated as a homeowners association 5 years ago, we thought it would be a good thing. Basic rules about keeping properties maintained, organizing community events, maintaining the common areas. We were happy to be part of a neighborhood that cared about itself. The problem started when Richard Blackwell moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago. He was a recently retired corporate executive from some big company in the city. He bought the largest house on the most expensive street, and within 6 months, he was running for HOA president. Blackwell drove around the neighborhood in his pristine white golf cart, taking notes on properties that did not meet his standards. He wore pressed khakis and polo shirts with the logos of expensive golf clubs. His gray hair was always perfectly styled, and he spoke with the confidence of a man who was used to getting his way. During his campaign for HOA president, Blackwell made big promises about elevating property values and bringing professional standards to our community. He talked about implementing new landscaping requirements and aesthetic guidelines that would make Sunset Ridge the premier neighborhood in the county. Most residents thought his ideas sounded reasonable. After all, who does not want their property values to increase? but I noticed the way Blackwell looked at our corner lot during his campaign visits. His eyes would linger on our garden with an expression I could not quite read. It was not appreciation, it was calculation. Some of these older properties have real potential, he told a group of neighbors during a campaign barbecue. With the right improvements, they could really contribute to our community's overall appeal. Grandpa Joe listened to these comments without saying much. He was not the type to make waves or get involved in neighborhood politics. He just wanted to tend his garden and live in peace. But I saw something in his eyes that day, a wariness that comes from a lifetime of dealing with people who mistake authority for wisdom. We had no idea that Richard Blackwell was about to turn our quiet corner of suburbia into a battlefield. And we definitely had no idea what my grandfather was capable of when pushed too far. Richard Blackwell won the HOA presidency by a landslide. His campaign promises of increased property values and professional management resonated with residents who wanted their neighborhood to stand out from all the other suburban developments. What we did not realize was that Blackwell had very specific ideas about what professional management looked like. His first official act as president was calling an emergency HOA board meeting. He presented a detailed PowerPoint presentation about new landscaping standards and aesthetic improvement requirements. The meeting lasted 3 hours, and by the end of it, our neighborhood had more rules than most small cities. Front yard landscaping had to follow approved plant lists with specific spacing requirements. Garden areas could not exceed certain size limits. Vegetable gardens were restricted to backyards only, and even then, they had to be screened from public view with approved fencing materials. The list went on, each rule more ridiculous than the last. 2 weeks after that meeting, I found the first violation notice tucked under our front door. The official HOA letterhead made it look important, but the content was absurd. Our family garden allegedly violated 3 different aesthetic standards that had been implemented without any input from the community. Excessive use of non-approved plant varieties, the notice read. Garden area exceeds recommended size limitations for corner lot properties. Failure to maintain uniform landscaping appearance consistent with neighborhood standards. I found Grandpa Joe in the garden that morning, harvesting tomatoes for our weekly farmers market donation. His movements were slow and deliberate, the way they always were when he was thinking hard about something. I handed him the violation notice and watched his face as he read it. 40 years, he said quietly. 40 years I have been growing food on this land. Now some man in pressed pants thinks he knows better than 4 decades of experience. His voice was calm, but I could hear the steel underneath. Grandpa Joe had faced down enemy soldiers in Vietnam. He was not about to be intimidated by a suburban bureaucrat with a clipboard. We called a family meeting that evening. My parents, my sister, and I gathered around the kitchen table while Grandpa Joe spread out the violation notice and the new HOA regulations. The more we read, the angrier we became. This is not about landscaping standards, my father said. This is about control. Blackwell wants to remake the entire neighborhood according to his personal vision. My mother suggested we try to work with the HOA board. Maybe we could get a variance or an exception based on the garden's historical significance to our family. My sister thought we should lawyer up immediately and fight the whole thing in court. But Grandpa Joe had a different perspective. Sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to give them enough rope to hang themselves, he said. Let us see how far Mr. Blackwell is willing to push this. The second violation notice arrived exactly 1 week later. This time, It came with threats of daily fines and legal action if we did not bring our property into compliance within 30 days. The tone was more aggressive, more personal. It felt like a declaration of war. That is when Richard Blackwell decided to pay us a personal visit. He rolled up to our front door in his golf cart on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand, and that same calculating expression on his face. He wore a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest, like he was some kind of official uniform. "I wanted to discuss your compliance issues in person," he said when Grandpa Joe answered the door. "I think there might be some confusion about the new standards." There was no confusion. Blackwell walked around our property like he owned it, pointing out violations and making notes on his clipboard. He spoke to my grandfather like he was explaining basic concepts to a child. "You have to understand, Joe, that individual preferences cannot take priority over community standards," Blackwell said. "What might look good to you might not be what is best for everyone's property values." Grandpa Joe listened without saying much. He answered Blackwell's questions with basic facts about the garden's history and his maintenance routines, but I could see the muscles in his jaw tightening with each condescending comment. "I built gardens for 30 years before I retired," Grandpa Joe finally said. "I know what good landscaping looks like." Blackwell smiled that same smug smile. "That may be true, but times change. We have professional standards now. We have systems and procedures that ensure consistency across the entire neighborhood." That visit lasted 45 minutes. When it was over, Blackwell climbed back into his golf cart and drove away, leaving behind an atmosphere of tension that hung over our property like storm clouds. "He is not going to stop," I told my grandfather. "This is personal for him now." Grandpa Joe nodded slowly. "Then I guess it is personal for me too." What started as bureaucratic harassment quickly escalated into something much more sinister. Richard Blackwell began driving by our house multiple times per day, taking photographs of our garden from different angles. He recruited other HOA board members to join his campaign, turning our family dispute into a neighborhood spectacle. The harassment became a daily routine. Blackwell would circle our block in his golf cart every morning, afternoon, and evening. He installed a high-powered camera in his own front yard that had a clear view of our corner lot. He started showing up at neighborhood events with printed photographs of our garden, pointing out supposed violations to anyone who would listen. I decided to fight back the only way I knew how. I spent hours researching HOA bylaws, state property laws, and homeowner rights. What I discovered made my blood boil. Richard Blackwell was massively overstepping his authority. Most of his new aesthetic standards had never been properly voted on by the community. Some of them directly contradicted the original HOA charter that we had all signed when we bought our homes. I scheduled a consultation with a property rights attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. The lawyer confirmed what I had suspected. We had legal grounds to challenge most of Blackwell's regulations. But then he delivered the bad news. "HOA litigation can drag on for years," he explained. "Even if you win, you could be looking at $50,000 in legal fees. And HOA boards have deep pockets. They can outlast most individual homeowners in a court battle." The legal system that was supposed to protect us was too expensive and too slow to provide real relief. We were on our own. Meanwhile, Grandpa Joe was conducting his own research. While I focused on legal strategies, he took a more practical approach. He installed discrete security cameras around our property. He documented every instance of harassment with timestamps and photographs. He reinforced the borders of our garden with additional fencing and protective barriers. His military training was showing. This was not just gardening anymore. This was preparation for a siege. The neighborhood began taking sides. Some of our longtime neighbors approached us quietly to express their support. They shared stories of their own conflicts with Blackwell's increasingly aggressive enforcement policies. Mrs. Chen from 2 streets over had received violations for her rose bushes. The Martinez family was being threatened with fines because their children's swing set did not meet approved recreational equipment standards. But other neighbors seemed genuinely afraid of crossing Blackwell. They avoided eye contact when we passed on the street. They stopped attending community events where we might be present. Fear was spreading through Sunset Ridge like a disease. Then the anonymous letters started appearing in mailboxes throughout the neighborhood. Professionally printed flyers with no signature or return address. They called our garden an eyesore that was dragging down property values for everyone. They urged neighbors to support the HOA board's efforts to maintain community standards. Your property taxes are paying for their selfishness, one letter claimed. How long will you let one family hurt your investment? The letters were vicious and personal. They attacked not just our garden, but our family's character. They suggested that we were being deliberately stubborn and unreasonable. They painted Grandpa Joe as a cantankerous old man who refused to accept progress. Reading those letters broke my heart. This was not about landscaping anymore. This was about whether one powerful person could use fear and intimidation to control an entire community. The final ultimatum arrived on a Friday afternoon in October. Official HOA letterhead, certified mail, return receipt requested. The language was legal and threatening, but the message was simple. Remove the garden completely within 30 days or face maximum fines and forced compliance measures. Failure to achieve full compliance will result in daily fines of $500 per violation, the letter stated. After 60 days of noncompliance, the HOA board reserves the right to remedy violations at property owner expense, including removal of noncompliant landscaping features. They were threatening to destroy our garden themselves and send us the bill. I found Grandpa Joe sitting on the front porch that evening, staring out at his life's work. The tomato plants were still producing their final harvest of the season. The herb garden was thick with basil and oregano that would soon need to be harvested before the first frost. 30 days, I said, sitting down beside him. He nodded slowly. 30 days. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun set behind the garden that had been our family's pride and joy for 4 decades. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the hum of Richard Blackwell's golf cart making another patrol around the neighborhood. "What are we going to do, Grandpa?" He was quiet for so long that I thought he had not heard me. Then he turned to look at me with eyes that had seen war and peace, triumph and loss, love and heartbreak. "We are going to teach Mr. Blackwell about consequences," he said. The morning of October 15th started like any other day. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard the familiar hum of Richard Blackwell's golf cart coming down our street. But this time, instead of just driving by, the sound stopped in our driveway. I looked out the kitchen window and saw Blackwell climbing out of his cart with his clipboard and camera. But something was different about his demeanor today. He moved with more confidence, more aggression, like a man who had finally decided to stop playing games. Grandpa Joe was already outside, kneeling beside his tomato plants and checking for late-season pests. He looked up as Blackwell approached, but did not stand. He just continued his morning routine, gently examining each plant with the care of a man who had been growing things for longer than most people had been alive. "Good morning, Joe," Blackwell said. His voice had a sharp edge to it that I had not heard before. "I am here for a final compliance inspection before the deadline next week." "Morning, Richard," Grandpa Joe replied without looking up. "You are welcome to look around from the sidewalk like always." That is when things took a turn that none of us expected. "Actually, I need to conduct a thorough inspection of the entire garden area," Blackwell said. "As HOA president, I have the authority to access any part of any property to document violations." Grandpa Joe stood up slowly. At 80 years old, he was still an imposing figure, 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could still do real work. He looked at Blackwell with the kind of steady gaze that had probably intimidated enemy soldiers 50 years ago. "You have no such authority," Grandpa Joe said calmly. "This is private property. You can document whatever you want from the public sidewalk." Blackwell's face flushed red. "Do not tell me what authority I have or do not have. I am the elected president of this HOA board, and every property owner agreed to certain terms when they bought their homes." "I know what I agreed to," Grandpa Joe said, "and it was not giving you permission to walk through my garden with your golf cart." I realized then that Blackwell had not planned to walk through the garden at all. His golf cart was positioned at the edge of our property line, pointing directly toward the heart of the garden where our prized tomato plants were heavy with their final harvest of the season. "I am going to document every single violation," Blackwell said, climbing back into his golf cart. "And if that means I have to drive through this mess to get proper photographs, then that is what I am going to do." The next few seconds felt like they happened in slow motion. Grandpa Joe stepped directly in front of the golf cart and held up his hand. "Richard, please, just walk around the edges. Some of these plants have been growing here for 40 years. They cannot be replaced." For just a moment, I thought Blackwell might listen to reason. He sat in his golf cart, engine running, staring at my grandfather with an expression I could not read. Then his face hardened into something cold and cruel. "Get out of my way, old man." Grandpa Joe did not move. "Please, I am asking you as one neighbor to another, do not do this." What happened next will be burned into my memory forever. Richard Blackwell gunned the engine of his golf cart and drove straight through the center of our family garden. The sound was horrible, the crunch of plants being crushed under wheels, the snap of wooden stakes that had supported tomato vines for months, the wet squish of ripe tomatoes being ground into the soil that had nurtured them. 40 years of careful cultivation destroyed in 30 seconds. Blackwell drove his cart in a slow, deliberate pattern, making sure to hit as many plants as possible. He crushed the heirloom tomatoes that came from seeds my great-grandmother brought from Italy. He destroyed the pepper plants that had produced the ingredients for countless family meals. He ran over the herb garden that smelled like my childhood memories of Sunday dinners. When he was finished, he parked his golf cart in the middle of the destruction and climbed out with a satisfied smile. I ran outside just as Grandpa Joe was surveying the damage. Decades of work reduced to broken stems and scattered soil. Plants that had been thriving just minutes earlier now lay dying in the morning sun. My grandfather's face showed no emotion, but his hands were shaking, not from age, from rage so pure and controlled that it was almost frightening to witness. "There," Blackwell said, brushing dirt off his polo shirt. "Now I can properly document all the violations without any obstructions." He took photographs of the destroyed garden from multiple angles, making notes on his clipboard like he was conducting a scientific survey. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. "You have 1 week to remove all non-compliant plant material and restore this area to HOA standards," he said. "Any remaining violations after the deadline will result in maximum daily fines." He climbed back into his golf cart and looked directly at my grandfather. "Maybe now you will understand the importance of compliance." Then he drove away, leaving us standing in the ruins of 4 decades of love, work, and family tradition. I expected Grandpa Joe to explode with anger. I expected him to call the police or grab a shovel, or at least say something about the injustice of what had just happened. Instead, he knelt down and gently picked up a broken tomato vine. He examined it closely, like he was trying to understand exactly how much damage could still be repaired. "Grandpa," I said. He looked up at me with eyes that were completely calm. "Some lessons," he said quietly, "can only be taught one way." The immediate aftermath of the garden's destruction was surreal. Neighbors who had witnessed the event stood on sidewalks and in their own yards, staring in shock at what Richard Blackwell had done. Some shook their heads in disgust. Others pulled out their phones to take pictures. A few just turned around and went back inside, like they could not bear to watch. Mrs. Patterson from across the street was the first to approach us. She was an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood longer than almost anyone else. Tears were streaming down her face as she looked at the destroyed plants. "Joe, I am so sorry," she said. "That man has lost his mind. What he did here is not just wrong, it is evil." But Grandpa Joe seemed surprisingly calm. He moved through the wreckage methodically, examining each destroyed plant and making mental notes about what could potentially be salvaged. His movements were precise and deliberate, like he was conducting some kind of scientific assessment. "We should call the police," I said. "What Blackwell did has to be illegal. Destruction of property, trespassing, something." Grandpa Joe shook his head. "The police will say it is a civil matter between property owners and the HOA. They will tell us to take it up with lawyers." "Then we call lawyers, we document everything, we fight this through the courts." Again he shook his head. "Courts take years. Lawyers cost money we do not have. And in the end, what do we get? Maybe some money for damages, maybe an apology. But the garden is still gone, and Richard Blackwell still thinks he can do whatever he wants to whoever he wants." I was frustrated by his calm acceptance of the situation. This was not the time for philosophical discussions about justice and revenge. This was the time for action, for anger, for fighting back against a bully who had crossed every possible line. But Grandpa Joe had a different plan. Over the next few days, he spent hours on his computer researching HOA bylaws, property boundaries, and county regulations. He printed out maps of the neighborhood showing exact property lines and common areas. He studied satellite images and surveyor reports that dated back to when Sunset Ridge was first developed. He also began documenting Blackwell's daily routines with the same precision he had once used to plan military operations. Every morning, Blackwell made the same circuit around the neighborhood in his golf cart. He parked in the same spots to take his violation photographs. He followed the same schedule, the same routes, the same predictable patterns. "Habits," Grandpa Joe explained to me one evening. "Everyone has habits, and habits create opportunities." Other neighbors began stopping by to share their own stories of harassment and intimidation. The Johnsons had received violation notices for their mailbox design. The Garcias were being threatened with fines because their children's bicycles were supposedly parked in violation of recreational equipment storage guidelines. Each story added another layer to the picture we were building of Richard Blackwell's abuse of power. But more importantly, each conversation gave Grandpa Joe additional information about Blackwell's methods, his schedule, and his weaknesses. "The man is predictable," Grandpa Joe told me. "He does the same things at the same times every single day. He parks his golf cart in the same spots. He follows the same routes. He even takes his harassment photographs from the same angles." I was starting to understand that my grandfather was not just documenting Blackwell's behavior. He was studying it. Like a general planning a military operation, he was gathering intelligence about his enemy's movements and vulnerabilities. The most important discovery came during his research into county environmental regulations. Sunset Ridge had been built on land that included several protected wetland areas. These areas were marked on official county maps and governed by strict environmental protection laws. "Look at this," Grandpa Joe said, showing me a county environmental survey map. "See this shaded area here? That is protected wetland. No vehicles allowed. No permanent structures. No disturbance of natural vegetation." The protected area included several sections of what the HOA claimed as common property, where residents were allowed to park golf carts and recreational vehicles. Blackwell has been parking his golf cart on protected wetland for 2 years, I realized. Every single day, he is violating county environmental laws. Grandpa Joe smiled for the first time since the garden was destroyed. Environmental violations carry serious penalties, heavy fines, restoration costs, legal liability that cannot be dismissed or appealed. That night I found him in the garage gathering tools and materials: shovels, measuring tape, plywood sheets, and rolls of sod. When I asked what he was planning, he just smiled again. "I am going to teach Mr. Blackwell about natural consequences," he said. I did not fully understand what he meant until 3 days later, when I woke up at 5 in the morning and discovered that Grandpa Joe was already gone. His truck was missing from the driveway, and his tools were missing from the garage. When I found him 2 hours later, he was calmly drinking coffee on the front porch, watching the sunrise like he did every morning. But there was something different about his expression. A satisfied look that I had not seen since before the garden was destroyed. "Beautiful morning," he said. "Perfect day for Mr. Blackwell to learn about respect." I knew something was different the moment I saw Richard Blackwell's golf cart that morning. He was following his usual routine, making his rounds through the neighborhood to document violations and intimidate residents. But when he reached his favorite parking spot near the community mailboxes, something went wrong. The golf cart broke through what looked like solid ground and disappeared into a hole that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I was watching from our front window when it happened. One moment, Blackwell was driving across the small patch of common area where he always parked his cart. The next moment, there was a loud crack, and his pristine white golf cart dropped 3 feet into the earth like it had fallen through a trapdoor. The look on Blackwell's face was priceless. Pure confusion followed by dawning horror as he realized his golf cart was completely stuck. The front wheels were buried in soft earth, the rear wheels were spinning uselessly in the air, and the whole vehicle was tilted at an angle that made it impossible to climb out normally. I ran outside to get a better view, and I was not the only one. Neighbors were emerging from their houses, drawn by the sound of Blackwell's panicked shouting and the whine of his golf cart's motor as he tried unsuccessfully to drive out of the hole. "Help," he was yelling. "Someone help me get out of here." But here is the thing about bullies. When they are the ones in trouble, people are not always eager to rush to their rescue. Mrs. Patterson was the first neighbor to reach the scene, but instead of offering help, she pulled out her phone and started recording. "Well, Richard," she said with barely concealed amusement, "it looks like you have gotten yourself into quite a predicament." More neighbors arrived, and most of them were doing the same thing, taking pictures, shooting video, and asking questions about how exactly a golf cart falls through solid ground. That is when Grandpa Joe made his appearance. He walked over from our house with the same calm, measured pace he used for everything else. He was carrying a clipboard and what looked like official county paperwork. He moved through the growing crowd of neighbors and approached the trapped golf cart like he was conducting some kind of inspection. "Morning, Richard," he said pleasantly. "Seems like you have got yourself into a bit of trouble here." Blackwell was red-faced and sweating, still trying to rock the golf cart out of the hole. "Joe, thank God you are here. Help me get this thing out. I do not know what happened. The ground just gave way." Grandpa Joe examined the hole carefully, making notes on his clipboard. "Interesting," he said. "Very interesting indeed." "What is interesting?" Blackwell demanded. "Just help me get out of here." That is when Grandpa Joe delivered the revelation that made everything clear. "Well, Richard, according to these county environmental protection maps, you are currently parked in a protected wetland area. Has been protected for 15 years now, ever since this neighborhood was developed." He held up the official county documents so everyone could see them. "Vehicles are strictly prohibited in wetland areas. Fines start at $5,000 for the first violation. Goes up from there for repeat offenses." The crowd of neighbors pressed closer to get a better look at the documents. Blackwell's face went from red to pale as he realized what was happening. "That is impossible," he stammered. "This is HOA common property. I have been parking here for 2 years." "Yes, you have," Grandpa Joe agreed. "Which means you have been violating county environmental protection laws for 2 years, every single day." He showed the documents to Mrs. Patterson, who read them carefully and then started laughing. "Richard Blackwell," she announced to the crowd, "you have been lecturing all of us about following rules and regulations while breaking the law yourself every single day." The irony was delicious. The man who had terrorized the neighborhood with threats about compliance and violations had been violating serious environmental laws right under everyone's noses. But Grandpa Joe was not finished. "Now about this hole," he continued, consulting his clipboard again. "Wetland areas have very soft soil underneath, especially after recent rain. The ground can give way without warning when heavy vehicles drive over it repeatedly." He looked directly at Blackwell with the same calm expression he had worn while surveying his destroyed garden. "I imagine the County Environmental Protection Office is going to want to investigate this incident thoroughly. They take wetland violations very seriously, especially when vehicles get stuck and potentially leak oil or other fluids into protected areas." By now, at least 20 neighbors had gathered around the scene. Everyone was taking pictures and video. Several people were already posting on social media. This was going to be all over the neighborhood Facebook groups within an hour. Blackwell was starting to panic. "Joe, please, we can work this out. Maybe we can discuss your garden situation. Maybe there is some kind of compromise we can reach." But it was too late for compromises. Grandpa Joe had spent weeks planning this moment, and he was not about to let it pass without making his point. "I already called the county environmental office," he announced. "They should be here within the hour to assess the damage and begin their investigation." The crowd erupted in applause and laughter. After 2 years of watching Richard Blackwell terrorize their neighbors with petty violations and power trips, they were finally seeing him face real consequences for his own behavior. As if on cue, a county environmental protection truck turned the corner and headed toward the scene. Behind it was a tow truck, ready to extract the golf cart from the protected wetland area. Grandpa Joe walked back toward our house, leaving Blackwell to face the music alone. As he passed me, he smiled and whispered, "Natural consequences." The county environmental protection investigation was swift and thorough. Within 2 hours, Richard Blackwell was facing fines totaling over $15,000 for repeated wetland violations. The golf cart extraction required specialized equipment to prevent further environmental damage, adding another $3,000 to his bill. But the financial penalties were just the beginning of Blackwell's problems. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that same evening. Word of the golf cart incident had spread throughout the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Social media posts and cell phone videos had turned Blackwell into a laughingstock. The man who had lectured everyone about following rules had been caught breaking serious environmental laws for 2 years straight. 5 of the 7 board members showed up to that meeting. By the end of it, Richard Blackwell had submitted his resignation as HOA president. The board voted unanimously to suspend all pending violation notices, pending a complete review of recent enforcement actions. The community support that followed was overwhelming. Neighbors who had been quietly enduring Blackwell's harassment for months finally felt safe to speak up. Mrs. Patterson organized a garden restoration fund that raised over $4,000 in the first week. The Martinez family donated labor and materials from their landscaping business. Even families who had never spoken to us before showed up with plants, tools, and offers to help rebuild. The new garden was planted in November, just before the first frost. It was smaller than the original, but it was also something more. It was a community garden, with contributions from a dozen families who wanted to be part of something positive after months of dealing with Blackwell's negativity. The local newspaper picked up the story, turning our neighborhood dispute into a feel-good feature about community solidarity and environmental protection. The county used our case as an example in their new public awareness campaign about wetland protection laws. Richard Blackwell made one final attempt at reconciliation 3 weeks after his resignation. He showed up at our front door with an expensive bottle of wine and what sounded like a rehearsed apology. "Joe, I want to apologize for my behavior," he said. "I may have gotten carried away with my responsibilities as HOA president. I hope we can put this behind us and move forward as neighbors." Grandpa Joe listened politely, then pointed to the new garden where neighbors were working together to plant winter vegetables. "Richard," he said, "some lessons stick better than others. I think you learned yours." The new HOA board implemented reformed policies that emphasized community cooperation over strict enforcement. Violation notices now required approval from 3 board members instead of just 1. Property owners gained the right to appeal decisions and request hearings before any fines could be imposed. Richard Blackwell moved out of Sunset Ridge 6 months later. I heard he bought a condo in a building with very strict rules about vehicle storage and environmental compliance. As for Grandpa Joe, he spent the rest of that winter planning next year's garden with input from all the neighbors who had contributed to the restoration fund. The new community garden produced enough vegetables to supply half the neighborhood and still have plenty left over for the local food bank. Sometimes the best revenge is not getting even. Sometimes the best revenge is building something better than what was destroyed. And sometimes, if you are patient enough and smart enough, you can teach bullies that actions have consequences. Natural consequences.